everybody, my name is Lincoln Easley, and through SDI, today's class, FTT 104, I'm going to be going over safety checks, safety procedures of working with firearm. And this isn't just the firearm I'm working with now, this goes with any firearm. First and foremost, there are 5 rules that I live by, that I grew up by. Rule 1, you always know what downrange is. You always know what you're shooting at downrange. So whatever is downrange, you got to know what the target is that you're shooting. Rule 2, you want to know what's past the target. You want to know what's on the other side of the target. So you want to know what's beyond the other side. Because when it comes to shooting and when it comes to doing what you're doing, you are responsible wherever that bullet goes. Rule 3, you always keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to destroy what's in front of you. And what I mean by that is when I'm holding a firearm, I always keep my finger extended out. I never touch the trigger until I'm ready to shoot. And it's very important to go by that, because if you go and reach in and you start grab by the trigger, you could hurt yourself or somebody else or do something far worse. So it's very important to follow these rules. And rule 4, and that's one of the most important rules, you always treat a firearm as if it's loaded. I don't care if it's a BB gun. I don't care if it's an airsoft, CO2. I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's even a cap gun. Treat it as if it's loaded. It's really good to practice this. I practiced this since I was 4 years old, and still to this day I still practice it. So any firearm I pick up, I always treat it as if it's loaded. I will double check it, triple check it 1,000 times if I have to. If somebody else hands me a firearm, I check it. I don't care what he says. I don't care if he's my best friend. I still check it, because this is a tool that's in my hand, and I have to make sure it's safe, and I have to know it's safe. I can't go off of what somebody else says. And rule 5. Rule 5 is kind of an interesting rule. It's something I kind of learned through my life. I wasn't really taught this rule. I kind of adapted this rule and learned this rule. And this is, if by some chance you have to break any of the 4 rules, remember safety. Safety comes first. So, going on to the next step, since we just went over the 4 rules of safety of firearms, we're going to be going over 2 ways you can find out how a firearm is safe before you handle it, before you take somebody else's firearm that you're going to get familiar with. And I think of it as, no matter how many 45 Colts are, no matter how many 45 ACPs, 9mm, no matter what you're shooting, every single one is different. Even of the same model or similar models, there's still slight differences of the shooting and of the handling of the firearms, the feeling, everything. Even to me, I could recognize a difference. So there's 2 ways that I find the history of the firearm. One, if I go to a client or somebody who's going to give me the gun, I make sure I get all the history of the firearms. I want to know the make, the model, everything about it. I want to know, has he ever had problems with it? When was the last time he serviced it? When was the last time he cleaned it, lubricated it, any of those things? What kind of ammunition does he shoot? Does he shoot steel shot? Does he shoot lead shot? Does he shoot brass? Does he shoot high dollar ammo, cheap ammo? Does he shoot lead? What does he shoot? Because all that could vary of how well the gun could shoot. Is it reloads? Is it factory? So when it comes to ballistics, when it comes to the firearm itself, when it comes to the model, all these could vary to what you're working with. Now, you could also go over and go online, or you could, if you do have one, you can get a owner's manual. This owner's manual is all the information on the firearm. Everything from weight, feel, model, what kind of code it has. Very good firearms. Could get a really good idea of what you're getting. So in this case, we're working with a Citadel 1911 A1 45 ACP. So this is one of my favorite guns. It's a really good gun. So this is a really good tool to have. I save every single one of these if possible. The second thing you're going to want, and I always do a printout when I work with any guns, I always have the schematics. Schematics are really good to have. It's really nice to have these around. It lets you know how the gun goes together, gives you an idea where all the parts go. It's not perfect, but it does help a lot. And the other thing I would also recommend is taking notes. Getting good notes for everything you have. Have a notebook. I always keep a notebook. I have a logbook of all the firearms that I have. It's my own personal registry of what I have and what I own. It gives me a log of when I clean my guns, when they're due to be cleaned, and when they need to be cleaned, and how often I lubricate them. So, because I have a good number of firearms, I need to make sure I know when I got to clean, when I got to replace parts, when I got to reload for. So having a logbook is very helpful. Even working as a gunsmith, you're replacing, you're cleaning, you're fixing guns, and you're probably doing 100 at a time. So you need to have a log of all the firearms. You need to have the security numbers, you need to have the serial numbers, you got to have all the entries, everything all set, so that way you yourself can order parts, you can get whatever you need to get. So, for the safety equipment that you may use, I would use a flag. Flags are really good. They use these on ranges, they use them at gun stores, they use them just about everywhere. It's a good way to do for safety for firearms. Another tool that is really good is a lock. These locks are pretty good. They're not really my favorite, but they do work really well. They do lock your gun. They pretty much turn your firearm into a paperweight. Nobody can shoot it. It's completely inoperable. But it doesn't mean I don't follow the rules of treating it like it's loaded. So when it comes to other safety equipment that you can use, we have what's called dummy bullets. So dummy bullets will allow me to check and make sure the firearm is cycling right, make sure everything's working right, make sure the striker's working, make sure everything's going. A good way to tell the difference between a dummy bullet and a actual bullet is where, in this case, if you look real closely, you'll see the primer is not spent, where this one, the primer is spent. The other thing I do is, if you notice, there's an X, and then there's an X on the lead of the bullet. And this one has no X, and has no X. So that way I can distinguish the difference between the two bullets. I don't have a 45 ACP bullet, but this does help with knowing how to keep things situated. Now, when it comes to handling the firearm, I like to keep the firearm down and handled. So before we do anything to the firearm, we're going to do a check, a safety check on the firearm to make sure it's not loaded. So first things first, deposit the magazine. And then I'm going to go through and I'm going to rack the slide back to check. Keep my finger off the trigger. So you rack it back, you'll see there's nothing inside there. And that's a good way to know that it is not loaded. I know for sure this gun is not loaded, it's good to go, it is ready to be worked on. So for safety, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to put the flag in the firearm, just to be on the safe side, knowing that it's unloaded and it's ready to go. Plus it helps you guys know that this gun is completely inoperable. There's nothing that this gun can do, it cannot shoot, it's all good to go. So for the tools that you might use for this firearm, is quite unique. So when it comes to cleaning a firearm and servicing a firearm or maintaining, there's things could vary. So one thing I like to have is I like to have a place to put my parts. These are cheap and expensive. I mean, you could go to Panda Express, save your bowls, and these are awesome. I love using these. They work really well. I put all my parts in them. Sometimes I'll glue magnets to the bottom of them to make sure the hot parts are held in place. You have little bitty parts, you gotta keep track of every single one of these. These things are like grandfather clocks. One missing part, gun is inoperable. The whole thing is useless. The second thing I like to use is a block. Blocks are pretty inexpensive. They work really well. They allow me to drop the pins. A lot of times what I will do, so I don't lose any parts, I'll put the block inside my parts bowl, so that way I can go through and drop my parts inside there. And that way I don't have to worry about losing parts, because you're dealing with springs, you're dealing with screws, you're dealing with all kinds of stuff you got to keep track of. Now, when it comes to tools, tools are quite interesting. When I go to the range, when I go anywhere, this is what I carry. This is all I need. This has all the tools that I need for having to fix and repair my gun. And one thing I always recommend, you may not need it, but I always carry a knife on hand. It's always good to have one. The second thing you would need, believe it or not, you need your punch kit. Punch kit is a valuable aspect. I may not need all these punches, but every punch has its purpose. Every tool has a purpose. I like to have dental picks. And the reason why I say dental picks is if there's little bitty parts, my fingers are too big to get out. So these work really well getting those little bitty parts out. The other thing I have is a hammer. These get at Harbor Freight. They're pretty inexpensive, a couple bucks. I love this. It's small, compact. It does the job. I keep a pen for keeping notes. I keep a little board cleaner in case I have to do a quick cleanup before I pull things out, or if I have to pop things out. I have my smaller grabbers. They're kind of like miniature size needle nose pliers. They work really well for getting little bitty parts out. And then I have my general pliers. Don't use these very often, but it's good to have them on board. And last but not least, my flashlight. Flashlights do really well. If I have to check inside the firearm, I can shine it inside and I'd be able to check and see if the firearm is clear of any obstructions. It's a good way because you do not want to go through looking down the barrel of the gun and see that there could be an obstruction and you're also breaking one of your rules. So this allows you to check the gun without breaking the rule. If you don't have a flashlight, you can run a snake down it. Snake runs really well. I advise do not run any metal down the rifle of your gun because you could damage or destroy a rifle, and that would not look good on a client if you're working on a client. So no metal down the barrel, no metal in the rifling. You got to be very careful on that. So I try really hard to avoid any kind of that, so that way I only use a snake. So for the oils that I use, and believe it or not, oils can go a long ways when it comes to safety. And this is the oils that I use. I don't use all of them at once, but I have different ones for different reasons. I got WD-40. Surprisingly, WD-40 works really well. I have different break-free. I have different lubrications, different oils. Some I take with me, some I don't when I go to the range. They all have their purposes. Some I can squirt directly in there. So these are all really good lubrications. I would not go wrong with any of these. If by some chance you ever are in a situation where you have no lubrications, my dad was in the sheriff department and he was at a range one time and it was 30 miles to the nearest store. So they actually used the dipsticks on their vehicles and used the motor oil to lubricate their guns so that way they wouldn't seize up, and made the guns function really well. So now that we are all set and we're ready, we can start field stripping this firearm. We know it's not loaded. We know it's safe. We got a good history of it. We got the schematics of it, and we got the handbook. So with all these tools and with what I have, I would be able to diagnose this firearm. I could find out what's wrong with it. It could be the wrong ammunition. It could be bad ballistics. It could be the firearm itself is malfunctioning, or it could be the user. It could be a number of things. But generally, it's either one of two things. It's the handler hasn't been cleaning and maintaining his firearm, hasn't served his pistol, or he has bad ammo. Is generally the two reasons why a firearm would malfunction. But I'm not saying that the firearm itself couldn't have parts go wrong, because you have the sear go wrong, you have the firing pin go wrong, you could have the hammer spring, you could have a lot of things that wear out because they are mechanical devices. They do not have feelings. So they cannot tell you what's going on. So you have to figure that out for yourself. So thank you so much. And this is a short description of going through and determining whether or not a firearm is safe.